Okay, now next thing that we have is, it's a very important question and also been repeated quite a few times. It is whether international law is a law in the true sense or not. Okay, so we need to answer if international law is a law in its true sense or not. How do you answer this question? We are going to just discuss briefly what all things are there in this. Now, this debate, this controversy, or this question whether international law is a law or now this debate, controversy, or question with regard to whether international law is a law in the true sense or not, it arises only because of the reason that the nature of international law is very different from a national law. We are otherwise used to seeing the national laws that are maybe applied to us, right? Being born in a certain country, we are used to seeing those national laws which are applied to us. But international law is quite different from natural law in terms of its nature, or in terms of how it is as a branch of law, right? It's quite different from national law, obviously, because it applies to a different situation, right? So it is very different, and just because of that reason, just because it's very much different from natural or national law or a municipal law, this debate, this controversy, or this question arises if international law is a law in the proper sense or not. Now, answering this question also helps us understand the true nature of international law. When we try to get an answer for this question, we also understand what international law is. What is its nature, right? It helps us understand international law in a better and in a deeper sense. Jurists like Austin, Pufendorf, Hobbes, Holland, Jethro Brown were of the opinion that international law is not a law in true sense. Okay, according to them, like all these different jurists, they have their own different concept, own different philosophy and ideology, right, with regard to what law is, what international law is, and all that different things. So these jurists, right, they have certain understanding with regard to law, that this is what law should be. Okay, like someone may say that law is something which originates from a sovereign. It's like having command of a sovereign person. It's binding on people. If you do not follow it, you will have to face the consequences, right? Like that, different jurists had their own different concept or understanding with regard to what law is. The view that international law is not a law is common among jurists who were trained and groomed under municipal law. If there is a jurist who have done quite a lot of study with regard to municipal law, and he has only focused mostly on municipal laws, right? In such a case, what happened is those jurists may start questioning international law. Why? Because they may have that tendency of finding the like nature of municipal law in an international law also. But now we know international law is quite different from municipal law, right? So if you start questioning, or if you start looking for those elements of municipal law in a national law, maybe you would feel that, okay, fine, it is not meeting all these different elements which I'm looking for. So is it actually a law or not, right? So you may end up asking that question, whether international law is a law in the true sense or not. And they tend to find all the attributes of municipal law in international law as well, right? Because if throughout my life I have been finding these few attributes in a law, I will obviously look for those attributes in an international law as well, right? And if I do not find those attributes in this new set of law, I may start questioning it. And that is what has happened here, is that some jurists tried to find the elements of municipal law in international law as well. And when they did not find those elements in international law, they started questioning it, that whether it is a law in proper sense or not. All right, so that is the main reason why we even have this particular question. Okay. Now, opinions of these jurists influenced lawyers and writers to a great extent, and Starkey called international law as weak law. So these opinions, or these different ideas shared by these jurists, have influenced writers to such an extent that Starkey called international law as a weak law. That even writers or other scholars have started having this question whether international law is a law in the proper sense or not. And they came to this point of categorizing it to be a weak law. Right? That means it is not having that much of sanction, validity, or authority as compared to municipal law. So it was even declared as a weak law. Okay. Now, municipal law and international law operate under different set of circumstances, right? Municipal law will be applicable in a maybe state, in a country, in a certain municipal area. But in case of international law, it applies with regard to our relations with another country, right? So its application is quite different for both these two different sets of laws. And hence, comparison between the two will not help us come to a valid conclusion. What can we compare? We can compare two similar things, right? We cannot compare two different things, right? If we are comparing two completely different things, we would not come to a valid conclusion. Like we can compare two different human beings, but or we can compare two different students, but we cannot compare one student with another working person, right? Why? Because they both will have different kind of demands from their job or from their college or school, right? And working professional may just give 9 hours full dedication in the office, but after returning home, that person may not do any work, any study or anything. That person may simply want to relax. But in case of a student, even after giving all the like complete focus, dedication and everything in your school or college, you are supposed to come back home and then study and revise your topics and all that stuff, right? So we cannot compare a student with a working person. Why? Because they have their like different kind of job role, different kind of responsibilities, obligation and all that stuff. So if we compare both of these two individuals, we will not come to a valid conclusion. Same thing will happen if you try to compare municipal law and international law. Why? Because they are completely different. They apply in two different situations. So if you want to compare at all, maybe you compare two different municipal laws and then you can come to a conclusion might be. But this comparison in itself is not good. Now, there are some arguments that favors that yes, international law is a law. Okay, so what are these arguments which tell that international law is a law in the true sense? We are going to see that. Now, firstly, law is not just something that is enacted by a sovereign and has sanction. It's not something that will come from a sovereign, like in case of parliament. In case of India, parliament will pass a legislation, maybe state legislature will pass a legislation and say that this is binding from now, you need to follow it, right? Or if you are not following it, you will have to face the consequences. But law does not simply mean something that is having like a sovereign authority and has sanction, right? It is not just something which would come from parliament. There can be rules which do not originate from a sovereign and they lack sanction. There can be these kind of rules. For example, in primitive societies, in ancient times, there was no sovereign, no political authority, but yet there were laws, right? People had their own laws, rules, and the people followed, right? Even though there was no kind of maybe punishment was not there, no sovereign was there. Like now we have different organs of government. Okay, fine, judiciary would punish you if you do not follow a certain law. Legislature would provide you what all things you need to follow. All those things were not there at that time in primitive societies, but still people followed the rules or regulations. Why? Because it helped them to stay together as a community, or in a certain jurisdiction. It helped them to stay together peacefully. Same may happen in terms of international law as well, that it's not just about the sanction or about the consequences that we would face in case we violate the law. We just not think about those and then follow the law. Sometimes we may also observe it even if it is not leading to any sort of consequences, just because it may benefit us, right? Just for collective benefit also we may try to follow those rules or regulations. So that is the first point, that It's not always necessary that law should have sanction and it should come from some sovereign authority or a sovereign body only. Okay, that is the first point that we have, which favors that international law is a law. Now, secondly, when international questions arise, states do not rely upon moral arguments but rely upon treaties, precedents, and opinions of specialists. If there is a question, right, international question arises at that time, states, different countries that we have, right, countries are called as states in international law. So different states or different countries that we have, they do not rely upon moral arguments, but they rely upon treaties. If there is a question that needs to be addressed, we start relying on whatever treaties, conventions, precedents, opinions, and other stuff we have. We try to look for those so that we can get some help, some reference from them in order to solve the given situation. Right? So that also tells us that international law is a law, and that is the reason why in case of any such international question that arises, that countries go and look for those treaties and they try to observe whatever is written there. Why? Because that is the option which we have, right, of answering those international questions. So that again is the second argument which is given in terms of international law being a law. Now, thirdly, states do not deny the existence of international law. On the contrary, they interpret international law so to justify their conduct. Even the different states or different countries that we have, all those different countries, they do not deny existence of international law, right? Different countries do not say that there is nothing called as international law. We are just governed by municipal laws. No, they do not do that, but rather they try to interpret international law. If a certain provision is given under a convention or treaty that they have ratified, they try to read that provision, understand that provision. Maybe they try to implement it in their national or municipal laws, or maybe they try to interpret their own provisions in terms of those provisions in a certain treaty. Okay, so states are also recognizing the importance of international law, and they are not denying the fact that international law is a law, right? So that also gives valid enough reasons to believe that international law is in fact a law in the true sense. Now, fourthly, international conferences and conventions also treat international law as law in its true sense. Whatever international conferences are there, whatever conventions are there, whatever different charters and all that stuff is there, right? Treaties, agreements, in all of those, international law is recognized, right? And based on that only, these like treaties and other stuff is being formed, right? So that also gives us an understanding or enough reasons to believe that international law is in fact a law. That is the fourth reason. Now, fifth one is, so far as sanction in law is concerned, international law does not completely lack it. It's not like in international law there is no sanction at all. There are provisions, there are certain provisions with regard to sanction as well. So this argument is not completely valid that international law lacks sanction and so it's not a law, right? So that argument also is not completely true. Next one is that the United Nations is based on the true legacy of international law. We also have different bodies or organizations which are based only because we have international law existing, right? We recognize United Nations as a body. Why do we recognize? Only because international law is there. It is established under international law. We are recognizing it. That itself indicates that international law is a law. Next is that it is true that international law is frequently violated, but it does not mean that international law is not law. Okay, fine. It may happen that international law is quite often violated by different countries, but that does not come to this conclusion. We cannot come to this conclusion that just because international law is being violated quite often, so it's not a law. We cannot conclude like that. Even state or municipal law is violated, right? We have seen so many different laws. We have IPC. So many people violate the provisions given there. Accordingly, punishment is given. But we do not say that, okay, fine, these many people are violating IPC, so IPC is not a law because people are violating it. We never say like that, right? So why do we conclude like that in terms of international law? That's the thing. Frequent violations of law indicate the weakness of enforcement machinery. Maybe with regard to enforcement of these different laws, we need to work on its enforcement. We need to make its enforcement better, but that will not be a valid reason to say that, okay, fine, international law is not a law. Maybe its enforcement system is not that strong. That is why it's being quite often violated by countries and have nothing to do with legality of the rules. So just because it is being violated, you can question its efficiency of the enforcement machinery, but you cannot question legality of its existence, right? Legality of rule and enforcement of laws are two different things. Obviously, enforcement of a certain rule or procedure is a different thing, and whether it exists or not, that is a completely different thing. So we should not mix both of those two different things. That is another reason or argument which is given. And last one is that United Nations is based on true legality of international law. It's a great example that will obviously help us understand ki, okay, fine, like international law is in existence, right? If you are recognizing the bodies which are established under international law, the functions that they are performing, then you will have to recognize the fact also, or accept the fact also, that international law in fact exists, and it is a like a good set of law that all the civilized nations try to follow, right? So that is the basic reason why we say that international law is a law. Okay, so we can conclude that yes, international law is a law, and we should not be comparing it with municipal or national laws, because they both operate in two completely different situations. So in conclusion, you may say that, as rightly remarked by Professor Hart, international law is law because states regard it as law. All the different countries who are following international law, they do recognize it. That is the reason why they are following it. Nothing need to be further proved, and we do not need to prove anything else, because the country itself is recognizing it, right? And that's what we need. International law is that branch of law whose significance and efficiency are constantly increasing. And it's such a time, such a situation, that the efficiency and the dependence on international law is constantly increasing only. And in such a point of time, it will not be valid question to ask whether international law is a law in the true sense or not. International law deals with matters like nuclear weapons, environment, and upon which the very survival of mankind itself depends, right? So as compared to national law, you can even go to the extent of saying that international law is playing a much important role, or a much, such a role which would impact us, right? It's a question about our existence itself. So in such a case, we should not be asking these questions that whether international law is a law in the proper sense or not. Okay, so that's about this particular question.